Shell Shock. Original author, unknown. My grandfather was a kind and generous man. He was the type of grandfather that would slip you a sweet or a biscuit after your parents had already said no, with a quick wink and a finger to his lip. The kind of old man who would roll up his sleeves and get stuck in helping your dad fix the car or put up shelves. Even well into his 80s. A slight stoop and a stock of white hair, and a deep, throaty laugh are the things that I will remember the most clearly about him. That and his penchant for smartness. You never saw him without a shirt and tie, a sports jacket, or a suit, and braces rather than a belt holding up his trousers. Just occasionally, he would freeze up. I don't really remember when I first noticed it, and it was really bizarre. One minute, he'd be chatting away happily to mom or grandma, a mug of steaming tea in his hand, and the next, he would just stop, frozen in time, as his eyes just glazed over. Even more weirdly, the conversation would just continue to flow around him, as if nothing had happened. A few minutes later, maybe even up to a half an hour, he'd unfreeze and then rejoin the conversation. His tea cold and forgotten. He drank a lot of cold cups of tea. I asked my mother about this once. She told me that sometimes Granddad froze up because of what he saw in the army, and it was a medical condition known as shell shock. I didn't really understand what that meant at the time, but it seemed a suitable answer to my young, inquisitive mind, and I pursued it no further. Like many of his generation, he'd been to war. He didn't talk about it much, but I remember seeing his medals in a drawer, tarnished and gathering dust. And I wondered why he didn't take better care of them. Later I found out, like many young men, idealistic young men, he'd volunteered in the summer of 1914. He had been sent out to France as part of the new service battalion 2 years later, just in time for the Great Reaping of Souls, known as the Battle of Somme. I snuck in once, years later, and pulled out the medals so I could take a look at them. There were 3. A bronze star with 2 swords across it, a silver one, and a gold one. There was also a dull bronze strip, about 2 inches long but very, very thin. I wondered what the medals were for, and this was before the days of Google. I had to go down to the library and look it up. The librarian recommended a stuffy old tome, with dull black and white pictures. But it depicted quite clearly the medals that I had seen in my grandfather's drawer. According to the book, they were British war medals. The British Victory Medal and the 1914 Star, irreverently referred to as Pip, Squeak, and Wilfred. The standard campaign medals awarded to most British servicemen who served during 1914. I found myself slightly disappointed that they weren't issued for some heroic deed. But I still wonder why he just shoved them in a drawer and forgotten about them. Then I remembered the bronze strip. I flicked through the book in the hopes of finding an illustration, and sure enough, there was a picture of a similar strip. According to the book, this was a wound stripe, awarded to soldiers who suffered an injury in battle. Suddenly, it all made a lot more sense, and I realized why he didn't like to talk about it with us. It also made more sense as to why he would occasionally freeze up. I assumed it was just something to do with the wound. My curiosity satisfied, I left the matter alone and soon forgot all about it. That Christmas, because I was 16, my dad let me have a few drinks with dinner, and afterwards, the men sat around the table with a glass of port and a cigar. We told jokes and talked about world affairs and generally enjoyed ourselves. This was the first time I'd been invited to stay, and it really felt like a privilege, being treated like one of the men. My mother, grandmother, and aunts left to chat in the kitchen and wash up, whilst my sister and cousins went into the lounge to play with their new toys. We chatted, joked, swore, laughed. We were having a great time just being men. No wives or kids within earshot. I really felt like I was a part of something. Uncle Bob had finished telling a risque joke about a barmaid when Granddad spoke up. When I was in the war, we all turned to him, our laughter subsiding, prepared to listen to what he had to say. I learned that after a few drinks, he'd occasionally start reminiscing about his war days, but never when Grandma or any of the kids were around. They were usually just some of the pranks that they played on the sergeant, or about one drunken night on leave. This story, it wasn't like those. One night, the sergeant told us that we were going on a night raid. Usual business. Up over the parapet after dusk. Quick look at the enemy lines, maybe snatch a sentry for interrogation and unit identifications. The brass always wanted to know who we were facing, as if it were a new unit, or a reserve one that might be worth planning an attack. I got tooled up with the rest of the lads, rifles, bayonets, and some ammo in pockets only. None of our usual marching kit, as it might get snagged on a wire or make some kind of sound to give us away. I was the number one on the Lewis gun, a big, heavy bugger, far too unwieldy to take on a raid. So, I was carrying my Webley revolver and a trench club that I had made from hammering hobnails into an axe handle. The thought of this made me feel queasy. I've seen photos of trench clubs in a library book. Evil-looking blunt instruments with vicious spikes. It's difficult to contemplate how someone as kind and as gentle as my grandfather could have made one of these for the express purpose of breaking bones and caving in skulls. We went forward through the churned earth, past the corpses of Jerry's last attack. I remember my mate Harry slipped through some poor bugger's entrails. He swore under his breath. The sergeant gave him a proper dark look for making a noise. We all smiled about the bollocking he'd get when we got back to our lines. We were all shitting ourselves with fear. He always did when he went out on a raid, so anything seemed funny at that point. When you see your mates die every day, when a shell, a bullet, or a bomb could kill you at any moment, you learn to live with the fear. You get used to it. But stepping out into no man's land, that's another fear altogether. You feel naked, alone in the universe. It feels like every sniper in the German army is trying to get the beat on you, ready to blow your head off. It's more than enough to drive a man mad. All talk had ceased around the table at this point. Everyone was listening in, intrigued by my grandfather speaking. He didn't sound like an old man anymore. The passion in his voice had the clear tones of a younger man. He was staring into the middle of the distance as he spoke. He had frozen up earlier that day, when my sister had squealed when she received a new Bunty annual. His face was the same now, except for his mouth. It was moving as he spoke. This time was worse. We all felt it. A cold fog had rolled over no man's land, which any other time would seem as a blessing as it masked our movement from Jerry. But that night, it seemed ominous, malevolent. We kept moving forward. We couldn't see enemy lines through the fog, but we knew they were close. We kept low and slow. As we moved up, I began to see a shape emerge from the fog. The sergeant saw it too. He waved us down into a holding pattern. We all drew a bead on the shape. After a few moments, we got a nod and began to move up. As we got closer, we began to make out the shape of a man. He didn't seem to be doing anything, just standing alone, staring at us. I'm not prone to superstition, but that was bloody creepy. I looked at the sergeant, he nodded to me. Fuck, I thought. I've got to go investigate. I stepped closer and began to make out a little more. He was definitely in a Jerry uniform, one of the old ones with the spiked helmet still on his head. I began to make out the features on his face, and I could swear that the guy was smiling at me. I took another step and felt something shift under my feet. I nearly pissed myself. I dare not look down to see what it was, as I didn't want to take my eyes off of whatever was in front of me. Another step closer, gripping my weapon with white knuckles. I suddenly noticed it. I nearly laughed out loud as the tension drifted away. He was hanging up on the barbed wire, caught up in the entanglements and as dead as a doorknob. I heard the tales from one of the old sweats. Men would get so entangled in the wire when they died that the wire would keep them standing up. Feeling completely relieved, I carried on towards him in a giddy state. I figured that the helmet would make a good souvenir. After all, this poor bastard didn't need it anymore. As I grabbed the spike, the head fell back. He trailed away, and for a second, I thought he was having one of his moments. But then he looked directly at me, focusing for the first time. I felt dread crawl up my spine. He didn't have any eyes, just two gaping holes, as if they had been ripped out by something or someone. His mouth was twisted in a rictus grin, as if he was involved in some sort of macabre joke. I felt the courage of a moment before just drain out of me. I dropped the helmet, which clattered to the ground. I had seen a lot of bodies by this point, some of them close friends, but something about this one seemed different, just wrong. The feeling of being watched crept over me again, and I wondered if this was some new and evil trap those bastards had set up for us. I wanted to curl up in a ball and hide, but I couldn't let my mates down. I turned around to see where they were, but the fog was thicker now, and I couldn't see them anymore. I had to find them. I had to let the sergeant know what I'd seen. So I began making my way back towards them. I would look back occasionally, a sixth sense not wanting me to take my eyes away from the corpse behind me. By this point, Granddad was staring back into the middle of the distance again. I glanced at my father, but the look on his face told me that this was a tale he hadn't heard before, and all the color had drained from his face. I had moved about 20 yards when I realized I should have came across him by now. I looked back, but the corpse had disappeared back into the fog. I was alone. I assumed that the sergeant had decided to call off the raid. The fog had gotten worse, and that they had just left me behind. Anger at being abandoned overcame my fear by this point, so I strode forward, determined to get back to our lines. I saw a shape ahead of me and assumed it was the rear guard of the unit, so I doubled my pace, hoping to catch up to him. As I moved closer, I realized that he wasn't moving, and instead, he was hung up on wire. With a sigh of frustration, I assumed that I had gotten turned around in the fog, and somehow made me double back to the corpse I had seen earlier. I resolved to go grab the helmet, so at least I'd have something to show for this whole mess. But as I approached, I began to feel that same sense of deep unease that I had before, and as I got closer, I realized why I was feeling so uncomfortable. It was a different man. Same pose, same sightless grin, but this man wasn't the German that I had seen before. He was wearing a British uniform. I vomited, right there. Not because he was dead, not because of the blood seeping from his eye sockets that was fresh, but because this wasn't just anybody. It was my friend, Harry. I felt sick. Harry had been on patrol with us. How could he be strung up in the wire like this? I tried to pull the fat, rusted strands of wire off of him, but all I succeeded in doing was tearing up my hands. My club and revolver were useless. I wish that I had wire cutters or even a knife. I fell at his feet, and I wept. I had no idea where our lines were in the fog, and I was helpless to do anything for my friend. As I laid there, tears streaming down my face, I heard a shrill scream which chilled me to the bone. I was frozen in place, terror overtaking all other feelings. I could have been there for minutes or hours, I couldn't tell. Then I heard the scream again, and this time, it triggered something in my brain. I just got up and ran. I didn't care anymore. I prefer a Jerry bullet to the brain than let whatever was out there catch me. It felt like I ran for hours, stumbling over shell holes and debris of no man's land. Eventually, I heard an English voice call out. I called back that I was a friend, and I stumbled into the front line trench. I was battered, bloodied, and worn from the wire and the debris that I had collided with on my run. But I had never felt so safe on the front line in all my life. I was the only man from my unit to ever return. Granddad paused for a moment, long enough that we all looked at each other wondering if the story was over. It had grown overcast outside. I could feel the cold in the dining room, despite the fire crackling in the grate. This pause lasted so long, I was desperate for someone to break the silence. Just as it looked like Uncle Bob would break the spell, Granddad spoke again. 2 weeks later, we mounted an attack on the same sector. I took a round in my shoulder in the confusion, and I laid in a shell hole for a day before the stretcher bearers found me. Apparently, I had lost a lot of blood and was swimming in and out of consciousness. When I came to, I had a hole in my shoulder, a bit of brass to say that I was wounded in combat, and this. He pointed to a faded white scar above his left eye. Something had tried to gouge my eye out. I never forgot the story my grandfather told me about his night in no man's land, the horrors he witnessed there. He never spoke about it again. And although over the next few years, after a few drinks late in the winter evenings, Uncle Bob tried to ask him about it, he'd always refuse. Last time Uncle Bob asked, the room went silent and suddenly felt cold. Granddad's gaze just went dead, in the exact same way he would, and he would just freeze up. No, I don't want to talk about it. Please just don't ask me again. He said very quietly. The conversation was stilted for the rest of the evening, and eventually he left in an awkward silence. Nobody, not even Uncle Bob, ever asked him about it again. When I was 19, my grandpa passed away. I was a year into my university course, the first member of my family ever to go. I felt a weight of expectation on my shoulders, especially from my granddad, who was just over the moon when I told him that I had been accepted. They probably got you confused with a smarter nipper with the same name, he would joke, but you could see how proud he was. It meant so much to him that one of his grandchildren had managed to get so far academically. He left school when he was 12, he used to tell us, to go apprentice as a riveter in a shipyard. My first year hadn't been too bad. I enjoyed myself, made friends, got drunk, and met girls. My course was good too. The first year hadn't been as hard as I was expecting. But now the second year had kicked in, and the workload was starting to rise. Still, studying history wasn't a hardship for me. I enjoyed it ever since my research into my granddad's medals when I was younger. There was something just captivating about flipping through old dusty tomes hunting for evidence, like I was some kind of historical detective. The news he had died, it hit me hard. My dad worked long hours at the post office, and my mom was always busy cooking, cleaning, and looking after my sisters. So I spent a lot of time with my grandparents growing up. He used to tell me these long, elaborate bedtime stories about King Arthur, knights, and dragons. He helped my love for nature and my love for history, buying me books about ancient Rome and Egypt. Looking back on it, they must have cost him a pretty big chunk of his pension. The funeral itself was a pretty somber affair. All the family was there. I read a heartfelt eulogy, which everyone said was very moving. But in truth, I just felt empty. I couldn't cry. I couldn't feel anything. It was like my emotions had just shut down. A few months later, I was back at university studying for an essay. I picked up a module on the First World War, partially as a tribute to my granddad, and partially because I had done a lot of reading around it and I thought it would be an easy credit. It wasn't. The professor was a real hard-ass, and with my granddad now passed away, a lot of the pictures and accounts struck closer to home. He lived through this. I remembered thinking as I leafed through a pretty hefty pictorial book of the war. That's when I saw an image that stopped me in my tracks. It was of a soldier being crucified. The hairs on the back of my neck rose. In my mind, I was suddenly back in that room at Christmas with Granddad telling his story. Soldiers hung up on barbed wire as if crucified, and their eyes had been gouged out. I started to feel deeply, deeply uneasy. I was working by the light of a desk lamp, and the shadows of my darkened room began to feel threatening. My eyes darted to the text below. Apparently, an officer in the Canadian Corps was seen by 3 witnesses crucified to a tree with bayonets in April of 2015. But there was no conclusive proof that such a crucifixion had actually occurred. The eyewitnesses' accounts were all somewhat contradictory, and no crucified body was found either. I read further, but the text then went on about British and American propaganda, and there was no mention about the officer's eyes. Perhaps this was just a coincidence, I thought, or just a rumor, or pure propaganda to make the Germans out to be monsters. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the fear in my granddad's eyes as he told us the tale. The darkness in my room felt malevolent as I played the story over and over and over in my head. Over the next few weeks, I pretty much read every book in the library about the First World War, looking for any information about crucified soldiers. I neglected my friends and my coursework. I was completely and utterly single-minded. I needed to find out more. Although I found plenty of references to the crucified Canadian, it was all in the form of propaganda. I couldn't find anything about any other cases. Feeling dejected, I went back to work on my lackluster essay and handed it in. I guess I didn't do very well on the essay at all. It was clear that my heart just wasn't in it. My professor asked me to come in and talk about it. I wasn't very forthcoming with him, and I could tell that he was getting frustrated with me. "You're a good historian, but this last essay was very poor. Your references were all over the place and your argument was very weak and full of missed opportunities," he said. I just nodded and mumbled something about not being confident. "It's not about confidence, it's about reading the sources," he said. "You should have known all this if you did the reading." "I did the reading," I retorted. "I just got distracted by something else." And then I thought, just screw it, and I told him about the crucified Canadian, and that my granddad had seen something similar. I didn't tell him the full story, though. He went very quiet and just stared at me for a moment, then turned and began digging through some papers on the desk behind him. I waited for a second, and when he didn't say anything, I got up and turned to leave. Kind of annoyed that he dismissed me in such a rude way. "Wait," he said, and I turned around. He had a stack of handwritten papers stapled together in the top left corner. He handed them to me. "Read this," he said, "and I want to see a marked improvement on your next essay." I left, confused, and went back to my student house. Once in my room, I looked at the sheaf of yellowing paper the professor had given me. The first page was in German. I laughed. The old prick was taking the piss on me for not reading the primary sources. And it was obviously his way of saying that I should learn German so I can read both sides. I nearly threw it in the bin. But as I picked it up, I noticed that the back of the page was in English. So I took it to my desk and looked through. I realized it was a transcript of an interview with a German, which had been subsequently translated into English. I began to read, and as I did, a chill ran down my spine. I've copied the English translation below. Interview with Gunter Muller, former officer, 17th Infantry Regiment, regarding a counterattack somewhere in the Somme region, late June 1916. As we charged forward, a shell must have gone off near me. I was stunned and thrown to the ground. I don't know how much time had passed when I came up, but I had dirt in my mouth and my eyes, and a pain in my right leg. The din of battle was still around. I remember the ground shaking with a concussive blast, the chatter of machine guns and the bark of rifle fire. I tried to move, but the pain in my leg was intense. I wiped some of the dirt out of my eyes and looked down. Blood was welling up and stained my field gray trousers in a few places. It didn't look life-threatening, but my leg would spasm with pain any time I tried to move it. I felt exposed and very alone. I couldn't find my helmet, and looking around, my rifle had been shredded by the blast and now looked like kindling. I realized that I had been thrown into the air and into an abandoned trench. Now I was somewhere in the middle of no man's land. I was unarmed and injured. I needed to get back to my own lines, but I was in no fit state to make it back in daylight. There was another man from my unit lying nearby, but he was dead. The interviewer then asked how he knew he was dead. Well, he was missing half of his head. Shrapnel wounds are just horrific. They don't put those pictures in the history books. It's much better to be shot with a bullet than torn up by a shell. I looked around the trench to see if there was somewhere I could hole up until the evening, and either the stretcher bearers found me, or I could crawl back to my own lines. The trench had been shelled heavily, and the wood supporting the sides had been badly broken up. It looked like it was one of ours, too. And despite the destruction, the underlying workmanship was much better than the English or the French trenches. One large piece of corrugated iron had fallen down and was resting on the duckboards in the parapet wall. But from where I was lying, there looked to be darkness behind it. I crawled over to it, dragging my leg behind me, and grabbed the corrugated sheet. To my surprise, it moved easily enough. Behind it was what I had been hoping for, the entrance to a dugout. I hoped that it hadn't been bombed into oblivion by the shelling, and that I could lay there until nightfall. I wish now that I had braved the crawl back to my own lines and never stayed in that godforsaken pit. But in my naivety, I thought it would be safe. I began to crawl under the iron and down the wooden steps. They were intact. The iron sheet must have gave them some protection from the shrapnel. It was pitch black down at the bottom, and despite the warmth on that June day, as I carefully crawled down the steps, the temperature cooled and the air felt damp. I could still feel the earth rumbling from the bombardment, but the sounds of the battle faded away the lower I got. It took my eyes some time to adjust to the dugout. When they did, I nearly jumped out of my damn skin. There was a man sat down in the dark, staring at me. I panicked and immediately raised my hands to show that I was unarmed, but he just sat there, staring. I was sweating and paralyzed with fear. My eyes continued to adjust to the blackness, and I realized with a wave of relief that the man was dead. He must have been that way for a while. His skin was stretched taut over his skull, and he had no eyes. Perhaps the rats had gotten to him. I was quite used to seeing death at this point. I think they call it desensitized. He was sat against a desk, and by the looks of things, this had been an officer's dugout. There were some home comforts that I could make out in the gloom. Even a gramophone was on a table in the corner. I looked around and I could see no other bodies, dead or alive, in there. And I remember it striking me as odd that he was still sat so upright, even in death. I was able to use a table to pull myself up, putting my weight on my good leg. As I did, I felt something on the table and picked it up. It was a Drycy pistol. That was an officer's weapon. Not as common as the Luger, but I had seen one before. I extracted the magazine and saw it was still loaded. So I tucked the gun into my leather belt at the front. I wasn't confident it would fire, but I could at least threaten someone with it. And it made me feel less naked. As I said, I was used to seeing death, but if I was going to be in here for some time, I didn't want that dead officer staring at me all day. So I decided to try and slide him off the chair and into a corner. I gingerly made my way around him using the table to take some weight off of my injured leg. It was just throbbing. I tried to push him off the chair, but although his head lolled, he didn't budge at all. That's when I noticed it. He was bound to the chair with barbed wire. I should have gotten out of there right then, taken my chances with the guns and the shells of no man's land, but I didn't. I think part of me thought that maybe it was just a mutiny or something. They tied up an officer and left him. It seemed callous, but then I'd never served under any truly terrible commanders who would have deserved this or worse. Maybe the shelling had dropped the corrugated iron over the entrance, so no one came down here. Then he starved to death, alone. His dugout becoming his tomb. I pushed harder. This time the chair toppled over, and the corpse hit the floor with a sickening thud. I nearly overbalanced myself as it tipped, and I put some weight on my injured leg and screamed out in pain. I half fell onto what was the officer's cot and laid there for a moment, as the agony coursed through me. The pain eventually subsided. I just laid on the cot thinking of home. At some point, I must have drifted off to sleep, because I awoke with a start. I lay there, eyes wide, listening intently. The events of that day rushed back to me. Something had woken me up. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing straight up, and I had this enormous feeling of dread inside of me. Some animal instinct was telling me that something was very, very wrong. I wasn't alone. I glanced over at the officer's corpse, but it was still slumped in the corner, bound to the chair. I drew a pistol from my belt and racked the slide. The trace light coming down the stairs was no longer there. I realized I must have slept until dark. The sounds from the battle earlier, the rumbling, everything, had stopped. I got up carefully off the cot, my injured leg protesting as I very carefully set it down. I kept my gun trained on the door, expecting a Tommy to come bursting through at any moment. My senses were overloaded. My hobnails were crunching on the rotten wood of the floor. They seemed as loud as gunshots. I could hear something, faintly outside, like movement in the trench above me. My mind was just racing. A patrol, perhaps, investigating this old trench? Were they on my side or theirs? Would they even find me down here? Would they check? Or would they just throw a grenade down first? I was absolutely terrified, but I felt the urge to find out. If they were on my side, maybe they could help me get back to our lines. If they were Tommies, at least I would know. I could attempt to hide until they moved on. I resolved to carefully make my way up the steps and peek out under the corrugated iron. It was a lot more difficult than I imagined. I was trying to keep the pistol pointed ahead of me, drag my injured leg, and make as little noise as possible. It seemed to take a lifetime. Each time my leg hit a step, it was just agony. Finally, I reached the top of the step and peered out into the darkness. There was someone moving out there. My heart was beating so fast I could hear the blood pumping in my ears. He had his back to me, and it seemed like he was bent over, doing something. I couldn't figure out what it was. But it was something wrong, though. He didn't look right. It was pretty difficult to read the next bit. It looked like the interviewer was prompting Gunter for more. I don't know how to explain it. I don't think I could quite process what I was seeing. His movements were wrong. His arms were elongated like a chimp's. His head was moving in a strange, jerking motion. I must have made a sound, or perhaps it sensed it was being watched because it suddenly stopped and whipped its head around. What I saw, the thing that I saw, was not human. It looked like it may have been at one stage, but the proportions, they were all wrong. Its eyes were too big, its face was sunken, its limbs were too long and too thin. I can't really describe it, but years later, when I read Token, it sounded the same exact way he described Gollum. Exactly. I know he fought for the British on Somme, so maybe he saw it too. Or something like it. I tried not to gasp at all, but I must have made some noise. Its darting, two big eyes stared right at me. Then it moved, unnaturally quickly, in almost a feline-like line towards me. The Dracy pistol barked in my hand, and then the bullet. With more luck than my aim, it hit the chest. It jerked back and let out a blood-curdling scream, the worst one I had ever heard. I can still hear it in my nightmares. The thing turned and scurried on all fours up the parapet out of the trench into no man's land. I was almost paralyzed with fear, and I just stayed still, the gun pointing where it had left the trench. After what seemed like forever, it didn't seem to be coming back, so I moved cautiously out of the trench, and once I did, I could finally see what it was doing. It had been tying up my dead comrade with barbed wire. He was spread eagle over a cross made of two rotting duck boards, his shell-damaged head lolling at a very unnatural angle, his hands pierced with bayonets and his wrists bound by barbed wire. His legs were still loose. I guess I interrupted that thing before it could finish. I had seen a lot of horror in this war, but right then and there, I was absolutely overwhelmed. I vomited. As I looked back at the unnatural hanging head, I noticed something. He was missing half his face from the explosion, but something had changed. Something was different. His remaining eye had been gouged out. I felt a shiver run up my spine at that last line. The rest of the account dealt with his escape from the trench and his journey back to his own lines. There was no further mention of the creature. I put the text down on my bed. My head was spinning. Corroboration of what my granddad had seen. Something taking eyes. A creature living in no man's land. And Token may have seen this one? I had recently reread Lord of the Rings. Perhaps there are more accounts out there. It's been 30 years, and although I found a few other references, hints perhaps that something was out there between the trenches, I've never found anything like the accounts of my granddad and Gunter Muller. And I know my granddad was telling the truth. And I'm still looking now. Guys, if you enjoyed this story and you want to become part of the Patreon and get some Patreon exclusive content, head over to the Patreon link in the description and you can join at the $10 or above tier. Just like the amazing Paul Z, Mr. Swiston, Official Jerboa, Chaos X, JY, Pyromancer, and Hayden MH. You get your name read off, you get some content, you know, fair trade. And if you join at the $5 tier, you get put in the description down below. Thank you guys for watching. Make sure you like, subscribe. Also, follow me on Twitter at RealCreepSin. Thank you guys.